On a cold November evening in the quiet town of Cedar Falls, Margaret Whitmore discovers a small boy wandering alone on Maple Street. The child appears lost, frightened, and completely silent. Margaret, a retired librarian who has lived alone for 15 years since her husband's passing, makes a decision that will change everything. She takes the boy home, feeds him warm soup, and waits patiently for him to speak. Hours pass in silence, until finally, just before midnight, the child looks directly at her and speaks his first word. That single word sends chills down Margaret's spine and connects this mysterious boy to a decades-old disappearance that shook their small community to its core. But how could this young child possibly know the name that no one has spoken aloud in 25 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through Margaret's lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the hardwood floors that Robert had refinished 30 years ago. She stood in her kitchen, watching the boy sleep, curled up on the living room sofa, his small frame barely making an impression on the cushions her late husband had favored for his evening reading. Margaret had always been methodical in her routines. Coffee at 6:30, toast with raspberry jam, morning news on the radio, while she tended to her small herb garden by the kitchen window. But today felt different. The presence of this silent child had shifted something fundamental in the rhythm of her days. She prepared a bowl of oatmeal with honey, the way she used to make it for her Sunday school children years ago when she still attended Cedar Falls Methodist regularly. Those children had grown up, moved away, started families of their own. Now they sent Christmas cards with photos of their own children, always including polite inquiries about her health that felt more obligatory than genuine. The boy stirred, his dark eyes opening to study the unfamiliar surroundings with the wariness of someone far older than his apparent 6 or 7 years. Margaret approached slowly, setting the bowl on the coffee table within his reach. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you hungry?" He nodded but didn't speak, those serious eyes following her every movement. Margaret noticed how he held himself careful, alert, as if ready to run at the first sign of threat. She recognized that posture. She'd seen it in the mirror enough times during those first months after Robert's funeral, when every knock at the door felt like an intrusion into her grief. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen tending to her prize-winning roses next door. Eleanor Chen had moved to Cedar Falls 40 years ago as a young bride, bringing with her an impressive collection of gardening knowledge and an even more impressive ability to notice everything that happened within a 3-block radius. If anyone would know about missing children or unusual circumstances, it would be Eleanor. The boy ate quietly, efficiently, as if he'd learned not to waste food or draw attention to himself. Margaret poured herself another cup of coffee and settled into Robert's old armchair, giving the child space while maintaining a comfortable presence. "I'm Margaret," she said eventually. "Margaret Whitmore. I've lived in this house for 42 years. My husband Robert and I moved here when we were newlyweds. He passed away 15 years ago, but I've stayed because this place holds our memories." The boy looked up from his oatmeal, studying her face with an intensity that was both touching and slightly unnerving. Children weren't supposed to carry such weight in their expressions. Margaret's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece where their wedding photographs still held place of honor. She and Robert, young and hopeful, standing outside the old courthouse with the autumn leaves creating a golden backdrop. They'd planned for children, had painted the small upstairs room in cheerful yellow, had discussed names and schools and all the beautiful dreams young couples share. But children never came, and eventually they'd stopped trying, stopped talking about it, had learned to find fulfillment in their quiet life together. After Robert's passing, the silence in the house had become both companion and burden. She'd grown accustomed to it, had even found comfort in its predictability. But now, with this child present, she realized how profound that silence had been. The doorbell chimed, and Eleanor Chen's voice called out, "Margaret, dear, are you home?" Margaret glanced at the boy, who had gone completely still, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "It's all right," she whispered. "Mrs. Chen is a friend. She brings me vegetables from her garden and makes sure I'm taking proper care of myself." She opened the door to find Eleanor holding a covered casserole dish and wearing her usual expression of kindly concern. "I saw your lights on very late last night," Eleanor said, then stopped mid-sentence as her eyes found the boy on the sofa. "Oh my. Eleanor, this—" Margaret paused, realizing she didn't know the child's name. This young man needed somewhere safe to stay last night. Eleanor's eyes, sharp despite her 78 years, took in the boy's too small clothes, his cautious posture, the way he seemed to shrink into himself under her scrutiny. "Has he spoken at all?" Eleanor asked quietly. Settling into the kitchen chair, Margaret offered, while keeping the boy in her line of sight. "Just once," Margaret replied, pouring tea from the pot she'd prepared. "One word and it was—" She hesitated, unsure how to explain the chill that had run through her when the child had whispered that name. Eleanor leaned forward, her weathered hands wrapped around the warm cup. "What word, Margaret?" Before Margaret could answer, the boy appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by their hushed conversation. He looked between the two women with those two serious eyes, then walked directly to Margaret's side. "David," he said clearly, his small voice carrying across the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down abruptly. The color drained from her face and she stared at the child as if she'd seen something impossible. "That's not possible," Eleanor whispered. "That name hasn't been spoken in this house for 25 years. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. David had been her maiden name before marrying Rob. But more than that, David had been the name of the boy who disappeared from Cedar Falls when she was still working at the library, still young enough to believe that missing children always came home safely. The boy, this boy, reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and white. He held it out to Margaret with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. Margaret took the item with trembling fingers. It was a hospital bracelet, the kind they put on children in emergency rooms. The plastic was still clean, relatively new, and printed in stark black letters, Samuel David Morrison. Beneath the name, a date from 3 weeks ago. "Samuel," Margaret breathed, testing the name. The boy nodded once, definitively. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, moving to peer over Margaret's shoulder at the bracelet. "Morrison," she read aloud. "Ray Morrison's family." Margaret knew Ray Morrison, Detective Ray Morrison, who'd investigated the original David case all those years ago. He'd been young then, ambitious, determined to bring that lost boy home. The case had consumed him for months, had aged him in ways that went beyond the passage of time. "Samuel," Margaret said again, crouching to the boy's eye level. "Is Ray Morrison your grandfather?" The child's face crumpled slightly, the first real emotion she'd seen him display since finding him on Maple Street. "Grandpa Ray," he whispered, then buried his face against Margaret's shoulder. Eleanor sank back into her chair. "Margaret, you need to call Ray immediately. If this child is his grandson, he's been searching everywhere. The whole department has been working overtime since the boy went missing from his foster placement." But Margaret found herself hesitant to make that call, her arms tightening protectively around Sammy. Something about the way he'd appeared on her street, the way he'd spoken that name, David, as if it meant something specific to her. There were too many coincidences, too many connections that didn't feel accidental. "The original David case," Margaret said slowly, still holding Samuel close. "Eleanor, you remember it, don't you? 7-year-old boy vanished from the playground behind the elementary school, never found." "Of course I remember. The whole town was turned upside down for months. Ray Morrison worked himself nearly into the ground trying to find that child." Margaret stood, Samuel still clinging to her side. She walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the street where she'd found him last night. Maple Street ran directly past the old elementary school, past the playground where another boy named David had disappeared 25 years ago. "What if," Margaret said quietly, "this isn't coincidence? What if Samuel knows something about what happened to David?" Eleanor joined her at the window. "That's impossible, Margaret. This child wasn't even born when David disappeared." But Samuel looked up at Margaret with eyes that seemed to hold secrets far beyond his years. "The man," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "The man with the big car." He said, "David couldn't come home." The kitchen fell silent, except for the steady tick of Robert's old wall clock. Margaret felt the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions, settling around them like dust on abandoned furniture. "What man, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Samuel's grip on her hand tightened. "The man who brings children to the big house. The man Grandpa Ray can never catch." Margaret made her decision quickly, before doubt could settle in. "Eleanor, I need you to stay with Samuel while I go to the library. There's something I need to check. Margaret, you should call Ray Morrison first." "I will," Margaret said, already reaching for her coat. "But not until I understand what we're dealing with. Give me 2 hours. The Cedar Falls Public Library stood on the corner of Main and Oak, a brick building that had served the community for over 60 years. Margaret had worked there for 35 of those years, had cataloged thousands of books, had helped countless residents research everything from genealogy to local history. More importantly, she had maintained the newspaper archive that stretched back to the town's founding. The current librarian, Janet Holbrook, looked up from the circulation desk with surprise. "Margaret, I didn't expect to see you today. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, dear. I need to access the old newspaper files, if you don't mind." The Cedar Falls Gazette archives from the... Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "Research project?" "Something like that." Margaret wasn't ready to explain, wasn't sure how to put her growing suspicions into words that wouldn't sound like the imaginings of a lonely old woman. The archive room smelled of old paper and dust, familiar scents that brought back memories of her working years. Margaret pulled the bound volumes of the Cedar Falls Gazette from 1999 and 2000, settling at the long table where she'd spent so many quiet afternoons helping patrons trace their family histories. The headlines brought it all back. "Local boy missing. Search continues for David Brennan. Family pleads for information." The boy's school photo stared back at her from the yellowed pages. 7 years old, dark hair, serious eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Samuel. She read every article methodically, the way she'd taught herself to research during her library training. David Brennan had disappeared on October 15, 1999, while playing at the elementary school playground after hours. His parents, Tom and Linda Brennan, had been frantic. The investigation, led by then-Detective Ray Morrison, had turned up no solid leads despite extensive searches. But it was the smaller articles, buried in the back sections of later editions, that caught Margaret's attention. References to other missing children in neighboring counties, children who had vanished without a trace, always from middle-class families, always between the ages of 6 and 8. Margaret made careful notes, cross-referencing dates and locations. A pattern emerged, one that apparently no one had connected at the time, or if they had, it hadn't made it into the newspaper accounts. "Find what you were looking for?" Janet appeared beside her, carrying a cup of coffee. "Perhaps." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully. "Janet, do you remember Detective Morrison from the old days? Is he still with the department?" "Oh yes, Ray's still around. Should be retiring next year, actually. He comes in sometimes to research cold cases. Still haunted by the ones he couldn't solve, I think." Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the man she'd only known professionally. To carry the weight of unsolved cases, especially those involving children, for 25 years. "Has he been in recently?" "Just last week. As a matter of fact, he was looking through these same files." Janet gestured to the bound newspapers. "Said he had new information about an old case, but didn't elaborate." New information. Margaret's pulse quickened. Could Samuel's disappearance be connected to Ray Morrison's renewed interest in the David Brennan case? She spent another hour in the archives, photocopying relevant articles and making detailed notes. By the time she returned to her house, she had assembled a timeline that painted a disturbing picture of systematic child disappearances spanning 3 counties and nearly a decade. Eleanor met her at the door, her expression anxious. "Margaret, Samuel drew something while you were gone. You need to see this." Samuel had found paper and crayons in Margaret's desk drawer, supplies she'd kept for the rare occasions when children visited with their parents. On the paper was a house, drawn with the careful detail that spoke of genuine memory rather than imagination. The house had distinctive architectural features: a wraparound porch, twin chimneys, and a peculiar octagonal tower on the left side. Margaret stared at the drawing, recognition dawning slowly. She knew this house. Every resident of Cedar Falls over 40 would know this house. "That's the old Brennan place," Eleanor said quietly. "Tom and Linda's house, where they lived when David disappeared." "But Margaret, this is impossible. That house has been empty for 20 years. The Brennans moved away right after David vanished, and no one's lived there since." Samuel looked up at both women with those 2 knowing eyes. "That's where the children go," he said simply. "That's where they..." Margaret stared at Samuel's drawing of the Brennan house, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed to defy logic. The child continued to color, adding details that chilled her, small faces peering from the octagonal tower windows, shadows that looked disturbingly like adult figures in the background. "Samuel," she said gently, sitting beside him on the sofa. "Have you been to this house?" He nodded without looking up from his drawing. "With the nice man," he said. "I could see my daddy there." Eleanor caught Margaret's eye, her expression grave. "Margaret, we need to call someone. This child needs professional help, and if there's any truth to what he's saying, there's truth to it." The voice came from the front porch, followed by a firm knock. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Detective Ray Morrison. I believe you have my grandson." Margaret's heart hammered as she opened the door to find a tall, weathered man in his early 60s. Ray Morrison had aged since she'd seen him last, his dark hair now completely silver, deep lines etched around eyes that held the weight of too many unsolved cases. But those eyes, they were Samuel's eyes, the same intelligent intensity. "Detective Morrison," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in." Ray's gaze immediately found Samuel, and the stern police officer facade cracked completely. "Sammy," he breathed, dropping to one knee as the boy launched himself into his grandfather's arms. "Grandpa Ray, I knew you'd find me. I drew the house like you taught me. I remembered everything." Ray held his grandson tightly, his eyes closing in relief. Over Samuel's head he looked at Margaret with profound gratitude. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know how to thank you. When Samuel disappeared from his foster placement 3 weeks ago, we feared the worst. The family said he just vanished from his bedroom in the middle of the night. He appeared on my street," Margaret said. "But Detective Morrison, there's something you need to know. Samuel has been talking about the David Brennan case. He drew the Brennan house and said that's where children go to wait." Ray's expression shifted, becoming sharp and professional. He studied Samuel's drawing with the intensity of someone analyzing evidence. "Sammy, can you tell Grandpa Ray about the niece man who took you to this house?" Samuel looked between his grandfather and Margaret, as if seeking permission. Margaret nodded encouragingly. "He had a big black car with soft seats," Samuel said. "He knew my name and said Mommy and Daddy were waiting for me at the special house. But when we got there, it was just empty rooms and shadows. He locked me in the tower room and said I had to wait until the other children came back." "Other children?" Ray's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders. "David was there first, in the drawings on the wall. He drew his name lots of times, and Sarah, and Michael, and lots of others. But they weren't there anymore, just their drawing." Eleanor gasped softly. Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Ray pulled out a small notebook, his movements practiced and methodical. "Sammy, can you describe this man? What did he look like?" "Old like you, Grandpa, but not nice. He had smooth hands and a gold watch that clicked. He smelled like the soap at the doctor's office. And he knew all about Mommy and Daddy's accident." Margaret watched Ray's face carefully. The detective was processing information with the efficiency of decades of experience, but she could see something else in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a long-held suspicion. "Detective Morrison," Margaret said quietly, "I spent the morning researching the old newspaper archives. There's a pattern of disappearances that goes back years, maybe decades. Children from middle-class families, always between 6 and 8 years old." Ray nodded grimly. "I've been tracking the same pattern. Samuel's case broke it open for us. We've been investigating a trafficking ring that targets specific types of children, usually those in vulnerable situations, kids in foster care or from broken homes." "But why the Brennan house?" Eleanor asked. "Why there specifically?" "Because," Samuel said matter-of-factly, "it's where the sad man lives, the one who takes pictures of all the children." He showed me the book with all the pictures. Ray's pen stopped moving. "What kind of book, Sammy?" "A big book with plastic pages. Pictures of children playing, pictures of them sleeping, pictures of them crying." Samuel's voice grew smaller. He said he was making a collection. Margaret felt sick. The scope of what Samuel was describing went far beyond a simple kidnapping case. "How did you get away?" Ray asked gently. Samuel looked at Margaret. "I remembered what you taught me about being brave. Grandpa, when he went to sleep, I climbed out the tower window and ran to find the nice lady. I knew she would help me because she looked like Grandma Rose." That evening, after Ray had taken Samuel to the station for a formal interview and medical examination, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. The house felt empty again, but differently now, not the comfortable solitude she'd grown accustomed to, but the hollow echo of secrets disturbed. Eleanor had gone home hours ago, promising to return in the morning. Ray had assured Margaret that Samuel would be safe at the station overnight, but he'd also warned her to be careful. If Samuel's captor realized the boy had escaped and talked, there could be danger. Margaret rose to lock the front door, then checked the back door as well, something she rarely bothered with in Cedar Falls. As she moved through her evening routine, she found herself thinking about the adoption papers she kept in the old secretary desk Robert had inherited from his mother. She hadn't looked at those documents in decades. They represented the most painful chapter of her life, one she'd buried so deep that sometimes she almost forgot it had happened. But Samuel's appearance, his knowledge of the name David, had stirred memories she'd thought were safely hidden. Margaret climbed the stairs to the small office where Robert used to pay bills and work on his amateur genealogy research. The secretary desk sat against the far wall, its pigeonholes stuffed with decades of important papers, insurance policies, property deeds, tax records, and in the bottom drawer, locked away, the papers she'd never shown her husband. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the small key she kept hidden behind Robert's World War II medals. The drawer slid open with a soft squeak, revealing a manila envelope she hadn't touched in 27 years. Inside, the adoption certificate was still crisp and official, bearing the seal of the state of Illinois and dated March 15, 1971. Baby boy born February 28, 1971 to Margaret Ann David, age 19. Unwed, father unknown. Adoptive parents Thomas and Linda Brennan of Cedar Falls, Illinois. Margaret sank into Robert's old chair, the paper trembling in her hands. David. She had named her son David, after her own family name, the son she'd given up because she was 19, unmarried, and terrified. The son Tom and Linda Brennan had adopted and raised as their own until he disappeared 25 years later. The missing boy, David Brennan, had been her biological son. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob that rose from somewhere deep in her chest. All those years working at the library, helping Ray Morrison research the case, watching Tom and Linda's desperate search for their missing child, and she had never known she was watching her own son disappear. She had attended the community meetings, had even helped organize the volunteer search parties. Tom and Linda had been grateful for her assistance, had treated her with the same kindness they showed all the volunteers. They had never known their son's birth mother was helping them search for him. But if David Brennan was her son, and Samuel was somehow connected to the case, could that mean? Margaret pulled out her calculator, working through dates with the methodical precision her library training had taught her. David would have been 28 when he disappeared, and if he had lived, if he had had children, those children would be the right age to Samuel. Could Samuel be her grandson? The possibility hit her like a physical blow. The resemblance she'd noticed in his eyes, the way he'd seemed to trust her immediately, the strange coincidence of his appearing on her street. What if none of it was coincidence at all? Margaret reached for the phone, then hesitated. Ray Morrison had enough to deal with tonight without her wild theories based on dates and possibilities. But the question burned in her mind: had David Brennan survived his disappearance? Had he grown up, started a family, maybe even tried to investigate his own childhood trauma? And if so, had that investigation put his son Samuel in danger? She thought about Samuel's description of the man with the smooth hands and gold watch, the man who knew about his parents' accident. If David had been searching for answers about his own disappearance, he might have gotten too close to whoever was responsible. Margaret folded the adoption certificate carefully and returned it to its envelope. Tomorrow, she would have to tell Ray Morrison the truth about her connection to the case. Tonight she would try to process the devastating possibility that she had lost her son twice, once to adoption, and once to whatever evil had taken him from the Brennan house 25 years ago. But she would not lose her grandson. Whatever it took, whoever was responsible for this nightmare, she would make sure Samuel was safe. After 25 years of not knowing, she finally had family again, and she would protect him with everything she had. Margaret barely slept that night. When morning came, she found a white envelope that had been slipped under her front door sometime during the dark hours. Her name was written across it in block letters, the kind of careful penmanship that revealed nothing about the writer. Inside, on plain white paper, a message in the same anonymous lettering: "Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Return the boy to his proper place. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. This is your only warning." Margaret's hands shook as she read the words again. Someone was watching her, knew about Samuel, knew she was asking questions. The comfortable safety of Cedar Falls suddenly felt like an illusion. She called Ray Morrison immediately. "I'm coming over," he said without hesitation after she read him the note. "Don't touch anything else, and don't open the door for anyone except me." Ray arrived 20 minutes later, with Officer Janet Mills, a young woman Margaret recognized from the grocery store. They both wore the grim expressions of people who'd expected this development. "Miss Whitmore," Ray said, carefully bagging the note and envelope, "I need to ask you something important. Is there any reason why you specifically might be a target? Any connection to this case beyond finding Samuel on your street?" Margaret took a deep breath. The time for secrets had passed. "Yeah, there's something I need to show you." She led them to Robert's office and retrieved the adoption papers from the secretary desk. Ray's expression changed as he read the certificate, shifting from professional interest to something closer to shock. "David Brennan was your son," he said quietly. "Biological son. Tom and Linda adopted him when he was 2 weeks old. I never told anyone in Cedar Falls. I was 19, unmarried, and scared. My parents sent me away to Chicago to have the baby, and I came back to Cedar Falls to start over." Officer Mills looked confused. "But that means Samuel could be my grandson," Margaret finished. "If David survived his disappearance and had children." Ray sank into Robert's chair, running his hands through his silver hair. "Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret, there's something I haven't told you about Samuel's case. His parents, David and Jennifer Morrison, they were killed in a car accident 6 months ago. But before he died, David had been asking questions around town about his adoption, about what happened to him as a child." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. David Morris, but his name was Brennan. He changed it legally when he turned 18. "Took my last name because Jennifer and I had been taking care of him since he was 16. He showed up at our door one day, half-starved and traumatized, with no memory of where he'd been for 9 years. 9 years, Margaret whispered. David Brennan didn't die when he disappeared in 1999. He was held somewhere, by someone, for 9 years. When he finally escaped, he was so damaged that Tom and Linda couldn't handle his trauma. They asked us to take him in, and we became his foster family. Eventually we adopted him ourselves." Officer Mills was taking careful notes. So the man who took Samuel knew about David's past. Knew he'd been asking questions. More than that, Ray said grimly. David had contacted a private investigator 2 months before he died. He was trying to piece together what happened during those missing 9 years. The PI found evidence of a trafficking ring operating out of this area, using the old Brennan house as a staging point. Margaret thought about Samuel's description of the book full of photographs, the collection the man had been making. Detective Morrison, how many children went missing during those 9 years? How many children was David held with? We don't know. David's memories were fragmented. He remembered other children, but couldn't give us names or clear descriptions. The trauma had affected his ability to recall specific details. The doorbell rang and all 3 of them froze. Ray motioned for Margaret and Officer Mills to stay back while he approached the front window. It's Eleanor Chen, he said, but his hand remained near his weapon. Mrs. Whitmore, are you expecting her? Margaret nodded, and Ray opened the door carefully. Eleanor stood on the porch holding a covered dish, but her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety. Margaret, dear, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I've been thinking about yesterday, but what Samuel said about the Brennan house. Eleanor's eyes found Ray and Officer Mills. Oh, I see you're busy. Come in, Eleanor, Margaret said. We need to hear what you're thinking. Eleanor set down her dish and clasped her hands nervously. It's about the house. I should have mentioned this yesterday, but I wasn't sure if it was important. My grandson works for the city utilities department, and he's mentioned several times over the years that the Brennan house still has active electrical service. The bills are paid by some company account, but the house has been supposedly empty for 20 years. Ray and Officer Mills exchanged meaningful looks. Someone's been maintaining that house, Ray said slowly. Someone's been keeping it operational for 2 decades. Ray Morrison made the call that would change everything. Within an hour, the Cedar Falls Police Department had assembled its largest operation in 25 years. Margaret watched from her living room window as unmarked cars positioned themselves around the neighborhood, while a team prepared to raid the Brennan house. But it was the phone call from the state police that shattered the case wide open. Detective Morrison, the voice on Ray's phone was crisp, professional. "This is Captain Torres from the Illinois State Police. We've been tracking your request about utility records for the Brennan property. You're going to want to sit down for this." Ray put the call on speaker so Margaret and Officer Mills could hear. "What did you find?" "The utility bills for that address have been paid for 23 years by an account registered to Cedar Falls Community Services. The signature on all the paperwork belongs to Mayor Richard Thornfield." The silence in Margaret's living room was deafening. Mayor Thornfield had been a fixture in Cedar Falls politics for over 30 years. He'd been mayor when David Brennan disappeared. He'd been mayor when the investigation stalled. He'd been mayor during every single one of the disappearances Margaret had documented in the newspaper archives. "That can't be right," Officer Mills said, her voice barely a whisper. Mayor Thornfield led the search efforts. He organized the community response. He was David Brennan's Little League coach. Margaret felt ice settling in her veins. "He was David's coach," she repeated slowly. He would have known David's schedule, his habits, his family situation. Ray was already reaching for his radio. "All units, change of plan. We need surveillance on Mayor Thornfield's residence immediately. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous." But the radio crackled with an urgent response. "Detective Morrison, this is Unit 7. Mayor Thornfield's vise was spotted heading toward the Brennan house 15 minutes ago. We lost visual when he turned onto the back access road." Margaret stood up abruptly. "He knows. Somehow he knows you're closing in." The threatening note, Ray realized. "He was warning you off because you were getting too close to the truth. When you called in Samuel's story when we started investigating the house, Officer Mills was coordinating with the tactical team through her radio. Sir, they're requesting permission to move on the Brennan house immediately. If Thornfield is destroying evidence." "Granted. All units, move in now." Margaret grabbed Ray's arm as he prepared to leave. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. This is a police operation, and if Thornfield is as dangerous as we think, that house contains evidence about my son's disappearance." Margaret said firmly. "About 9 years of his life that were stolen from him. I've waited 25 years for answers, Ray. I'm not waiting in my living room while you find them." Ray studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod reluctantly. "You stay in the car, no matter what happens. You stay in the car." The drive to the Brennan house took only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Margaret watched the familiar streets of Cedar Falls pass by, seeing them differently now, not as the safe, quiet community she'd called home for 42 years, but as the hunting ground of a predator who'd hidden in plain sight for decades. The Brennan house sat at the end of Elm Street, surrounded by overgrown hedges that had once been Linda Brennan's pride and joy. Police vehicles were positioned at every possible exit, their occupants moving with the practiced efficiency of a major operation. Ray parked behind the command vehicle, where Captain Torres was coordinating the assault. Margaret could see the house clearly from her position. The wraparound porch, the twin chimneys, and the octagonal tower where Samuel had been held prisoner. Movement in the tower window, came the report over the radio. "One adult male appears to be destroying documents." "That's him," Ray said grimly. "Thornfield is trying to eliminate the evidence." The tactical team moved forward in formation, approaching the house from multiple angles. Margaret held her breath as they reached the front door, watched as they announced themselves and demanded entry. The response came not in words but in smoke. Black smoke began pouring from the tower windows. "He's burning everything," Captain Torres said into his radio. "All units move in immediately. We cannot let him destroy 25 years of evidence." Margaret watched in horror as flames became visible in the tower windows. Somewhere in that fire were the photographs Samuel had described, the records of children who had disappeared, the proof of what had happened to her son during those missing 9 years. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure appeared briefly in one of the lower windows, not the tall, distinguished form of Mayor Thornfield, but something smaller, child-sized. "Ray," she screamed, pointing at the window. "There's someone else in there. There's a child in that house." The radio erupted with urgent voices as the tactical team received new orders. They were no longer just raiding a crime scene. They were conducting a rescue operation, and every second counted as the flames spread through the old house that had held so many secrets for so many years. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen making pancakes for breakfast, the sound of Samuel's laughter drifting in from the living room where he was building a fort with the couch cushions. The morning light streamed through windows that had been fitted with new security glass, a reminder of how much their lives had changed since that November evening when she'd found a lost boy on Maple Street. The trial had been national news. Mayor Richard Thornfield, Cedar Falls' respected leader for 3 decades, had been revealed as the architect of a trafficking network that had operated across 3 states for over 25 years. The evidence recovered from the Brennan house, despite the fire damage, had been overwhelming. Photographs, records, financial transactions, all pointing to a systematic operation that had stolen the childhoods of dozens of children. The child Margaret had seen in the window that day had been 9-year-old Emma Patterson, who had been missing from a neighboring county for 6 months. She was safe now, reunited with her family, though like David and the other survivors, she would carry the scars of her experience for the rest of her life. David Morrison, Margaret's son, had been Thornfield's first long-term captive. The mayor had kept him for 9 years, using him to help manage the other children, training him in the twisted logic of survival that had ultimately allowed him to escape when he turned 16. David's death in the car accident had been genuine, but his final months had been spent gathering evidence against the man who had stolen his childhood. His private investigator had compiled a file that proved instrumental in the prosecution. "Grandma Maggie, come," Samuel called from the living room, using the name that still made Margaret's heart swell every time she heard it. She found him standing proudly beside a complex structure of cushions and blankets. At 7 years old, Samuel was growing stronger every day, his nightmares becoming less frequent, his trust in the world slowly rebuilding under the patient care of the therapist Ray had found for him. Ray himself had been a constant presence in their lives. The official adoption papers had been finalized last week, making Margaret Samuel's legal guardian and cementing what had already become true in their hearts. They were family. Ray visited daily, often staying for dinner, becoming the grandfather figure Samuel needed, and the friend Margaret had never expected to find at this stage of her life. "It's a castle," Samuel explained, pointing to various architectural features of his blanket fort. "This is where the brave knights live, and this is where they keep the treasure safe." Margaret admired his construction with appropriate gravity. "It's magnificent, sweetheart." "Very secure." Eleanor Chen knocked on the back door, carrying a covered plate that undoubtedly contained some delicious offering from her kitchen. Eleanor had become something of a celebrity in Cedar Falls, having been the first to notice suspicious patterns that helped break the case. She wore her newfound fame with typical grace, deflecting attention back to the importance of community vigilance. "How's our young architect today?" Eleanor asked, finding Samuel in his fort. "Building defenses," Samuel replied seriously. "Grandpa Ray taught me that every castle needs good defenses." Ray arrived as if summoned by the mention of his name, carrying a newspaper and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had finally closed the case that had defined his career. "Morning, everyone," he said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his regular spot. "Thought you'd want to see this." The Cedar Falls Gazette had run a feature story about the community's healing process, focusing on how the revelation of Thornfield's crimes had actually strengthened the bonds between neighbors. Margaret's story, how a lonely widow had become the center of a new family and helped solve a decades-old mystery, was featured prominently. "Listen to this," Ray read aloud. "Margaret Whitmore's courage in protecting a vulnerable child and pursuing uncomfortable truths serves as a reminder that heroism often comes in quiet packages. Her willingness to open her home and her heart changed not only her own life, but potentially saved countless other children from a terrible fate." Margaret felt herself blushing. "I didn't do anything heroic. I just helped a child who needed help." "And that," Eleanor said, settling into her own chair with a cup of tea, "is exactly what makes it heroic." Samuel emerged from his fort, climbing onto Margaret's lap with the casual affection that still amazed her. For 42 years, this house had been quiet, filled only with the memories of the family she and Robert had wanted, but never had. Now it echoed with the sounds of actual family laughter, questions, the daily negotiations of life. With a curious 7-year-old. The old wedding photograph still sat on the mantelpiece, but it was joined now by new pictures. Samuel's school photos, snapshots of family dinners, images of Ray teaching Samuel to fish at the lake behind town. The past hadn't been erased, but it had been joined by a present full of unexpected joy. Outside, Cedar Falls continued its daily rhythm, a community forever changed by the revelation that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. But it was also a community that had learned the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they chose to care for one another. Margaret looked down at Samuel, whose dark eyes held no trace now of the fearful, silent child she'd found on Maple Street. In his place was a boy who laughed easily, who trusted deeply, who was learning that the world could be both dangerous and wonderful, and that the difference often lay in the choices made by people who simply decided to help. "What shall we do today, sweetheart?" she asked. Samuel considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important decisions. "Can we visit the library? I want to show Miss Janet my new book." "Of course we can." Margaret smiled, thinking of the irony that her story had begun and ended with libraries, with the careful preservation of records and the patient search for truth. "We can do whatever you'd like." And in the warm kitchen of the house on Maple Street, surrounded by the family she'd never expected to have, Margaret Whitmore discovered that sometimes the most important chapters of life begin when you think the story is nearly over. The Cedar Falls Library felt different now, bustling with an energy that hadn't existed during Margaret's working years. Janet Holbrook had implemented new programs since the Thornfield case brought national attention to their small-town child safety workshops, community watch training, and a special archive dedicated to preserving the stories of survivors. Margaret walked through the familiar stacks with Samuel's small hand in hers, remembering the countless hours she'd spent here cataloging books and helping patrons research their family histories. Now she was researching her own family's future, helping Samuel understand his heritage through carefully chosen books about adoption, family trees, and the many different ways families could be formed. "Miss Janet," Samuel called out as they approached the circulation desk. "I brought my new book to show you." Janet's face lit up at the sight of them. Since the trial, she'd become one of Samuel's favorite people, always having a new book recommendation or puzzle waiting for his visits. "Samuel, let me see what you've been reading." Janet examined the book he proudly held out, a chapter book about a young detective solving mysteries in his neighborhood. "This is quite advanced for someone your age. You're becoming quite the reader." "Grandma Maggie helps me with the big words," Samuel explained, "and she tells me stories about when she worked here before I was born." Margaret felt that familiar warmth that came whenever Samuel referred to their shared history as if he'd always been part of her life rather than the miraculous addition he actually was. The therapist had explained that children were remarkably resilient, that Samuel's ability to form healthy attachments was a testament to his inherent strength and the stability he'd found in Margaret's care. "Whitmore," Janet said quietly while Samuel wandered to the children's section, "I wanted to let you know that we've had several inquiries from other libraries wanting to learn about our community response protocols. Your story has inspired a lot of people to think differently about how we protect vulnerable children." "I didn't do anything that any decent person wouldn't do," Margaret replied, but she was learning to accept that her actions had indeed made a difference beyond just her own family. "That's exactly the point," Janet continued. "You saw a child in need and acted on that instinct. You asked questions when things didn't make sense. You didn't assume someone else would handle it. That kind of individual responsibility is what prevents tragedies." Samuel returned with an armload of books, his selections revealing the eclectic interests of a bright 7-year-old recovering from trauma. Adventure stories, books about space, a cookbook designed for children, and a large picture book about different types of family. "Can we check out all of these?" he asked hopefully. "Of course we can," Margaret said, though she suspected they'd only get through half of them before their next visit. Samuel approached reading with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time, devouring stories with an appetite that reminded Margaret of her own childhood love affair with books. As Janet processed their selections, she mentioned something that caught Margaret's attention. "We're planning a special exhibit for next month about the history of adoption services in our county. The Historical Society has been collecting stories and documents. I wondered if you might consider contributing David's story, when you feel ready, of course." Margaret considered this carefully. David's story was painful, but it was also part of the larger narrative, about how communities could fail children and how they could protect them. Samuel looked up at her with curious eyes, and she realized that someday he would want to know everything about his father's experience. "I think David would want his story told," Margaret said finally. "Not for sensation, but for education. If it helps even one person recognize warning signs or trust their instincts about a child in danger, then yes, I'd be willing to contribute what I know." Samuel tugged on her sleeve. "Can we go see the special room now? The one with all the old newspapers about Daddy?" Margaret's heart clenched slightly. Samuel had begun referring to David as his daddy more frequently, constructing a relationship with the father he'd barely known through stories Margaret and Ray shared with him. The therapist encouraged this, saying it was healthy for Samuel to claim his heritage while building his new family bonds. They made their way to the archive room where Margaret had spent that crucial morning researching the pattern of disappearances. Now it housed a small memorial display, not just for David, but for all the children whose stories had been recovered during the investigation. Samuel studied the newspaper clippings with the serious attention he brought to everything related to his father. "Daddy was brave," he said quietly. "Even when he was scared, he was brave." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "He was very brave, and you have that same bravery in you." As they prepared to leave the library, Margaret reflected on how the building that had once represented her quiet, solitary work life had become a place where she and Samuel explored their shared future. The past hadn't been erased or forgotten, but it had been transformed into something that could teach and protect rather than simply haunt. The first snowfall of winter arrived early that year, blanketing Cedar Falls in pristine white that transformed the familiar streets into something magical. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching Samuel build his first snowman in her backyard with the focused determination he brought to all his projects. Ray had arrived an hour earlier with hot chocolate mix and a bag of carrots, declaring it essential that Samuel experience a proper Midwest winter. Now he was outside helping position the snowman's head while Samuel directed the operation with the authority of an experienced architect. A little to the left, Grandpa Ray. No, the other left. Margaret smiled as she watched them work together. Ray had embraced his role as grandfather with the enthusiasm of someone who'd thought that chapter of his life was closed forever. Since his retirement from the police force last month, he'd been spending even more time with them, filling the role of male figure that Samuel needed while giving Margaret the family support she'd never expected to have at this stage of her life. Eleanor appeared at the back gate, carrying a thermos and wearing the thick winter coat that made her look like a cheerful snowball herself. She'd appointed herself the unofficial supervisor of all outdoor activities involving Samuel, a role she took seriously despite being nearly 80 years old. "That snowman needs a proper scarf," Eleanor announced, producing a red woolen muffler from her coat pocket. "And perhaps some buttons." Samuel ran to her eagerly, accepting the scarf and a handful of large black buttons she'd brought from her sewing box. His cheeks were pink with cold and excitement, his eyes bright with the simple joy of childhood play that had been absent for too long. Margaret opened the back door and called out, "Hot chocolate is ready when you're finished with your masterpiece." "5 more minutes, Grandma Maggie," Samuel called back. "We need to make him perfect." The phone rang inside, and Margaret hurried to answer it, recognizing the number of Dr. Patricia Howell, Samuel's therapist. Their weekly sessions had been reduced to monthly check-ins as Samuel continued to thrive, but Dr. Howell still maintained regular contact. "Margaret, I hope I'm not interrupting your weekend," Dr. Howell said. "I wanted to touch base about Samuel's progress report. The results of his latest assessments are quite remarkable." Margaret settled into her kitchen chair, keeping one eye on the snow construction project outside. "He seems to be doing well. The nightmares have almost stopped entirely, and he's been sleeping through the night consistently." "More than well," Dr. Howell replied. "His resilience scores are exceptional. Children who experience the kind of trauma Samuel endured typically show long-term effects for years, sometimes decades, but Samuel's recovery has been accelerated by several factors. The stability of your home environment, the consistency of his routine, and most importantly, the genuine love and security he feels with you and Ray." Margaret watched Samuel carefully wrapping Eleanor's scarf around the snowman's neck, his small hands working with patient precision. "He's taught me as much as I've taught him, I think. About resilience, about finding joy in simple things. That's exactly what I mean." Dr. Howell continued, "You've created an environment where healing can happen naturally. Samuel knows he's safe. He knows he's loved, and he knows he belongs. Those are the fundamental building blocks of recovery." Through the window, Margaret saw Samuel step back to admire their completed snowman, then throw his arms around Ray in an enthusiastic hug. Ray lifted him easily, spinning him around in the snow while Eleanor applauded from her position by the fence. "Howell, I have a question," Margaret said. "Samuel has been asking more questions about his father lately, about David's experiences. How much should I tell him?" "Follow his lead," Dr. Howell advised. "Answer his questions honestly, but age-appropriately. He's building his identity, and understanding his father's story, both the difficult parts and the resilient parts, will help him make sense of his own experiences. The key is to frame David as a survivor, not just a victim. Margaret understood. Samuel needed to know that his father had endured terrible things, but had also found the strength to escape, to build a life, to have a family. David's story wasn't just about what had been done to him, but about what he'd chosen to do despite it. After hanging up the phone, Margaret prepared mugs of hot chocolate, while her family, for that's what they had become, finished their winter project. The snowman stood sentinel in her backyard, complete with Eleanor's red scarf, her buttons, and a face made from stones Samuel had carefully selected from the garden border. When they finally trooped inside, stamping snow from their boots and peeling off layers of winter clothing, the kitchen filled with the comfortable chaos of a real family. Samuel chattered excitedly about the snowman's personality, which he'd decided was that of a friendly guardian who would watch over their house all winter. "He looks like someone who would keep children safe," Samuel announced, settling into his chair with his mug of hot chocolate. "Like you and Grandpa Ray do." Margaret met Ray's eyes over Samuel's head, seeing her own wonder reflected there. They had all found something they'd thought was lost forever. Family, purpose, the simple blessing of loving and being loved in return. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the guardian snowman stood watch over the house on Maple Street where healing had transformed strangers into family. Spring came early to Cedar Falls that year, bringing with it the annual ritual of cleaning and renewal that Margaret had observed for decades. But this year felt different, as she worked alongside Samuel to plant their first garden together, watching him carefully space marigold seeds in the flower bed that had been Robert's pride and joy. "Like this, Grandma Maggie?" Samuel asked, his small hands cupping the soil protectively around each seed. At 8 now, he'd grown taller and stronger, but he still approached new tasks with the same thoughtful precision that had characterized his recovery. "Perfect, sweetheart." "Your father loved gardens too," Margaret said, sharing another piece of David's story. She'd been weaving these memories into their daily conversations, helping Samuel build a picture of the father he was learning to understand. "He used to help me with the library's community garden when he was about your age." Samuel looked up with interest. "Before the bad things happened?" "Yes, before that. He was curious about everything, just like you, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things were." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring sunshine warming their backs as they prepared the soil for the vegetables Ray had suggested they try growing. Samuel had been enthusiastic about the idea of producing their own food, seeing it as another adventure in their expanding world. The sound of a car door closing drew their attention to the front of the house. Margaret wasn't expecting visitors, and Samuel immediately moved closer to her side, a reflex that had diminished but never entirely disappeared. Even in his healing, he remained alert to unexpected changes. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's Detective Mills." Officer Janet Mills, now Detective Mills after her promotion following the Thornfield case, appeared around the side of the house carrying a small wrapped package. She'd stayed in touch with their family, partly from professional obligation but increasingly from genuine friendship. "Janet, what a lovely surprise," Margaret said, brushing soil from her hands. "Samuel, you remember Detective Mills?" Samuel nodded politely. He'd developed good relationships with several members of the police force, understanding now that these were people who helped keep children safe rather than figures to be feared. "I hope I'm not interrupting your gardening," Janet said. "I wanted to stop by, because we received something at the station that belongs to Samuel." She held out the wrapped package, which Samuel accepted with curiosity. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with intricate carvings along the edges. "This was among your father's personal effects," Janet explained gently. "It was in storage at the state police facility, and they just finished processing all the evidence from the case. Your father made this box during his recovery, and according to the notes, he intended it for his future children." Samuel opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a collection of small treasures: smooth stones, a carved wooden bird, a pressed flower, and a folded piece of paper with David's handwriting. Margaret watched Samuel's face as he explored each item, seeing wonder and sadness mixing in his expression. He unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a simple message in David's careful script. "For my children, if I'm blessed to have them, these are things that helped me remember beauty exists, even in dark times." "Can you read it to me, Grandma Maggie?" Samuel asked, though Margaret suspected he could read most of it himself. He often asked her to read things that carried emotional weight, as if her voice could make difficult truths easier to bear. Margaret read the message aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion the words stirred in her heart. David had created this collection during his healing process, choosing objects that represented hope and resilience to pass on to the next generation. Your father wanted you to know that even when life is difficult, there's always beauty to be found, she explained. He saved these things to remind himself of that truth, and now they're for you. Samuel held the carved wooden bird up to the light, examining the delicate details David had created. He made this himself? Yes, Janet confirmed. Woodworking was part of his therapy. He became quite skilled at it. Samuel placed the bird carefully back in the box, then looked at the pressed flower, a daisy that had somehow retained its cheerful yellow center despite the years. I want to add something of my own, he decided. Something beautiful that I found. He ran to the flower bed they'd been working on and carefully selected a perfect tulip that had bloomed early, its red petals bright against the spring soil. He brought it to Margaret with the solemnity of someone making an important offering. We'll press this and add it to your father's collection, Margaret said, understanding the significance of the gesture. Samuel was claiming his inheritance while adding his own contribution to the legacy of finding beauty in difficult times. As they sat together on the front porch, examining each treasure in David's box, Margaret realized they were participating in a conversation across time. David speaking to his son through carefully chosen objects, Samuel responding with his own discoveries, and she herself serving as the bridge between past and future, helping them understand each other across the years that had separated them. The Cedar Falls Elementary School's annual spring concert had always been one of Margaret's favorite community events during her working years. Though she'd attended alone, watching other people's children perform while nursing her own quiet grief about the family she and Robert had never had. This year she sat in the front row beside Ray and Eleanor, her heart full as she watched Samuel take his place with the second-grade choir. He stood in the back row with the other 8-year-olds, his dark hair neatly combed and his white shirt pressed to perfection. Margaret had spent the morning helping him practice his solo verse, listening patiently as he sang the simple song about spring and new beginnings that seemed particularly appropriate for their family's journey. He looked so confident up there, Eleanor whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Remember how shy he was when you first brought him home? Margaret did remember. The silent, frightened child who had barely spoken seemed like a different person from the boy who now stood on stage, ready to share his voice with an audience full of neighbors and friends. The music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, raised her hands to signal the beginning of the performance. Margaret recognized her as the mother of Emma Patterson, the child who had been rescued from the Brennan house the same day as the raid. Emma was in Samuel's class now, and the two had formed a friendship based on shared understanding that went deeper than their years. As the children began to sing, Margaret's thoughts drifted to the conversation she'd had with Samuel's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, during their conference the previous week. Samuel was excelling academically, but more importantly, he was demonstrating the social skills and emotional stability that indicated his healing was continuing on track. He's become something of a leader among his classmates, Miss Rodriguez had explained. He has a natural empathy that draws other children to him, especially those who are struggling with their own challenges. Yesterday, I watched him help a new student who was having trouble making friends. Samuel has this way of making people feel safe. Now, watching him on stage, Margaret could see what Miss Rodriguez meant. Samuel's presence seemed to steady the other children around him. When one little girl forgot her words during a speaking part, Samuel subtly prompted her, and when a boy in the front row looked nervous, Samuel caught his eye and gave him an encouraging smile. When Samuel's solo verse arrived, his clear voice rang out across the auditorium. After winter comes the spring, every seed can grow, every heart can find its song. Every child can know that love will find a way to heal what once was broken. Love will find a way to say what can't be spoken. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Samuel's voice carried the simple but profound message. The words could have been written for their story, about love finding its way to heal broken hearts, about the unspoken understanding that had formed between a lonely woman and a traumatized child. Ray reached over and squeezed her hand, his own eyes bright with emotion. David would be so proud, he whispered. After the concert, they gathered in the school cafeteria for the traditional reception of cookies and punch. Samuel was surrounded by classmates and their families, all eager to congratulate him on his performance. Margaret watched from across the room as he handled the attention with grace, accepting compliments while deflecting some of the focus to his classmates. Principal Morrison, no relation to Ray despite the shared name, approached Margaret with a warm smile. "Miss Whitmore, Samuel is such a joy to have in our school. His teacher tells me he's considering joining the student council next year. Leadership seems to come naturally to him. He's learned the importance of speaking up for others." Margaret replied, thinking of how Samuel had found his voice not just literally but in terms of advocating for what was right. Dr. Howell had explained this phenomenon during one of their sessions. Children who had survived trauma and found healing often developed exceptional empathy and leadership skills. They understood vulnerability in ways that other children didn't, and that understanding could become a source of strength rather than weakness. As they prepared to leave the school, Samuel ran up to Margaret with Emma Patterson beside him. "Grandma Maggie, Emma's family wants to know if we'd like to come to her birthday party next weekend. Her mom said to ask you." Margaret looked across the room to where Rebecca Patterson was waving at her with a grateful smile. The two mothers had developed a friendship born of shared experience. The knowledge of how close they'd come to losing their children, and the gratitude for their safe return. "Of course we can go," Margaret said. "That sounds wonderful." As they walked to Ray's car under the soft spring evening sky, Samuel chattered about the concert, about his friends, about the birthday party he was already planning for. Margaret listened to his voice, no longer the whispered words of a frightened child, but the confident tones of a boy who knew he was loved and protected. The journey from that November night when she'd found him on Maple Street to this moment had been filled with challenges and discoveries, but listening to Samuel's happiness now, Margaret knew they had built something beautiful together. A family forged not by biology alone, but by choice, commitment, and the healing power of unconditional love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered with the regular mail but bearing the official seal of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, though she knew it contained good news. The final paperwork confirming Samuel's adoption was complete and permanent. Samuel was at school, finishing his second grade year with the kind of enthusiasm that made Margaret grateful every day for his resilience. She decided wait until he got home to share the official confirmation of what their hearts had known for months. They were legally, permanently, unquestionably family. The house felt especially quiet that morning, filled with the peaceful silence that Margaret had once treasured, but now missed when Samuel wasn't there to fill it with his questions, his laughter, his constant stream of observations about the world around him. She made herself a cup of tea and settled at the kitchen table to read through the documents carefully. The adoption decree was simple in its language but profound in its implications. Samuel David Morrison was now Samuel David Whitmore, carrying forward his father's memory while claiming his place in Margaret's family line. She traced the official signatures with her finger, thinking about the bureaucratic journey that had brought them to this moment. Ray arrived while she was still reading, letting himself in through the back door with the familiarity of someone who belonged in the space. Over the months, he had become as much a fixture in Margaret's kitchen as the old wall clock that had counted the hours of her solitary years. "Good news?" he asked, nodding toward the official papers spread across the table. "The best news," Margaret replied, handing him the adoption decree. "It's official. Samuel is legally my son now." Ray read through the document with the careful attention he'd once given to police reports, then looked up with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Congratulations, Grandma. Though I have to say, the paperwork is just catching up to reality. That boy has been yours since the night you found him." Margaret felt the truth of that statement settle around her like a comfortable shawl. The legal process had been necessary, but the real adoption had happened gradually over months of bedtime stories, homework help, scraped knees comforted, and bad dreams chased away by patient presence. "There's something else," she said, pulling out another document from the packet. "Samuel has requested to have his father's full name added to his own. He wants to be Samuel David Morrison Whitmore. He said he wants to carry both families forward." Ray's eyes misted slightly. "That boy has wisdom beyond his years." David would be honored. They sat in companionable silence for a while, both understanding the weight of this moment. Samuel's adoption represented more than just the creation of a new family. It was the healing of old wounds, the continuation of David's legacy, and the proof that love could indeed find a way to repair what had seemed irretrievably broken. The school bus rumbled down Maple Street at exactly 3:15, and Margaret went to the front window to watch Samuel bound down the steps with his usual energy. He waved goodbye to the bus driver, called out to a friend, and then ran toward the house with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Grandma Maggie," he called as he burst through the front door. "Guess what happened at school today? Miss Rodriguez said I'm reading at a 4th grade level, and Emma and I finished our science project early, and Tommy Peterson invited me to a sleepover party." And he stopped mid-sentence, noticing the papers on the kitchen table and the expressions on Margaret's and Ray's faces. His natural alertness, honed by difficult experience, kicked in immediately. "Is everything okay?" he asked, moving to Margaret's side with the protective instinct that sometimes surfaced when he sensed adult conversations he couldn't quite interpret. "Everything is perfect, sweetheart," Margaret said, lifting him onto her lap despite his protest that he was getting too big for such treatment. "I have something wonderful to tell you. The adoption is final. You're officially my son now, for always and forever." Samuel studied her face carefully, processing this information with the gravity he brought to important announcements. "Does this mean no one can take me away from you, even if they think they have a good reason?" Margaret's heart clenched at the question, understanding the fear behind it. "No one can take you away from me now. Samuel, you're my son legally, officially, and permanently. This is your home and I am your family, for the rest of our lives." Samuel wrapped his arms around her neck and held tight. Over his shoulder, Margaret saw Ray wiping his eyes with his handkerchief, and she knew they were all thinking the same thing, that sometimes the most important journeys begin when you think you're simply helping a stranger, and sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens you never expected to carry. "Can we celebrate?" Samuel asked, pulling back to look at her with eyes that now held security instead of fear. "Can we make a cake and invite Grandpa Ray and Mrs. Chen? We can do whatever you want," Margaret replied. "This is your day, Samuel David Morrison Whitmore." He tested his new full name silently, his lips moving as he worked through the syllables, and then grinned with satisfaction. "I like it. It sounds like a name for someone who belongs somewhere important." "You do belong somewhere important," Margaret assured him. "You belong right here, with us, forever." The first anniversary of the night Margaret found Samuel arrived with the kind of November chill that brought back vivid memories of that life-changing evening. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the bare branches of the maple tree in her front yard sway in the wind, remembering how different her life had been just 1 year ago. Samuel was at the table behind her, working on a school project about family history that had taken on special meaning given their unique circumstances. He'd been interviewing Margaret, Ray, and Eleanor for weeks, collecting stories and photographs to create what his teacher called a family journey timeline. "Grandma Maggie," Samuel said, looking up from his carefully organized materials, "can you tell me again about the first thing I said to you? I want to make sure I get it right for my presentation." Margaret turned from the window and sat beside him, looking at the poster board where he'd been arranging photos and written accounts in chronological order. At the top, he'd written how our family found each other in his careful 3rd grade handwriting. "You said David," Margaret replied, as she had many times before. "Just one word, very quietly, right before midnight. And you knew that was important, because David was my daddy's first name and also because of the other boy named David who went missing a long time ago." "That's right." It was like a key that unlocked a mystery we didn't even know we were trying to solve. Samuel nodded seriously and wrote a few more notes in the margin of his timeline. "Miss Rodriguez says my project is special because most kids just write about where their grandparents were born and stuff like that. But our story is about how families can be made in different ways." Margaret studied his work, marveling at how he'd organized their complex history into a narrative that made sense to his 8-year-old understanding. He'd included photos of David as a child, pictures of Margaret's wedding to Robert, newspaper clippings from the Thornfield case, and recent photos of their life together. "What are you going to say about the scary parts?" Margaret asked gently. Samuel's therapy had progressed to the point where he could discuss his traumatic experiences without distress, but she wanted to make sure he felt comfortable sharing those details with his classmates. "I'm going to say that sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that doesn't mean the story has to end sadly," Samuel replied with the wisdom that continued to surprise her. "Dr. Howell says trauma can make people stronger if they have the right kind of help and love." The doorbell interrupted their conversation, and Margaret opened it to find a delivery person holding a large package addressed to Samuel. After the man left, Samuel examined the return address with curiosity. "It's from Emma's mom," he said, carefully opening the box to reveal a beautiful scrapbook with his name embossed on the cover. Inside was a note from Rebecca Patterson. Margaret read the note aloud. "Dear Samuel, this scrapbook is for you to keep all the memories of your new family. Emma and I wanted you to have something special for your adoption anniversary. We know how important this day is, and we're so grateful that you and your grandmother found each other. Love, Rebecca and Emma Patterson." Samuel ran his fingers over the smooth cover of the scrapbook, his expression thoughtful. "Grandma Maggie, do you think it's okay to be happy about the day we met, even though I was scared and sad when it happened?" Margaret considered the question carefully, understanding the complexity of what he was asking. "I think it's perfectly okay to be grateful for good things that came from difficult experiences. Being happy about finding each other doesn't mean we're happy about the scary things that happened before. Like how Daddy probably wasn't happy about being taken away, but he might have been happy that it made him strong enough to help other people later. Exactly like that. Your father's experiences were terrible, but he used his strength to try to protect other children. And your experiences led you to our family, which has brought all of us joy." Samuel began transferring some of his photos from the school project into the new scrapbook, arranging them with the same careful attention he brought to everything important. As he worked, he chattered about his plans for the anniversary celebration cake, of course, and maybe a movie night with Ray and Eleanor. "Next year for our second anniversary, I want to do something special for other kids who don't have families," Samuel announced. "Maybe we could donate books to kids in foster care, or help at the shelter where they take children who need safe places to stay." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride at his thoughtfulness. "That sounds like a wonderful way to honor our anniversary. I think your father would be very proud of that idea." As evening approached, Margaret helped Samuel finish his school project, watching him tape the final photo onto his timeline. A recent picture of their whole chosen family gathered around the dinner table. In the photo, Samuel sat between Margaret and Ray, with Eleanor beside them, all of them laughing at something Samuel had said. "Perfect," Samuel declared, stepping back to admire his completed work. "This shows how we went from being strangers to being family. Miss Rodriguez is going to love it." Looking at Samuel's timeline, Margaret realized he'd captured something profound about the nature of family and healing. Their story wasn't just about rescue or adoption. It was about how love could transform strangers into family, how trauma could become strength, and how the most important chapters of life sometimes began with the simplest acts of kindness. The phone call came on a snowy December morning while Margaret was helping Samuel build a gingerbread house at the kitchen table. The caller identified herself as Maria Santos from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and she had a request that would change their understanding of their role in the larger story of healing. "Miss Whitmore," Maria explained, "we've been following Samuel's case and your family's journey through the adoption process. We're developing a training program for foster families and social workers, and we'd like to feature your story as an example of successful trauma recovery and family formation." Margaret glanced at Samuel, who was carefully placing gumdrops on the roof of their gingerbread house with the focused concentration he brought to all creative projects. At 9 now, he had grown into a confident, articulate child whose earlier trauma was visible only to those who knew what to look for. "What exactly would that involve?" Margaret asked, stepping into the living room for privacy. "We'd like to interview you, Samuel, and Detective Morrison about the factors that contributed to Samuel's successful recovery. Your story demonstrates several important principles about child resilience and the power of stable, loving placement. We believe it could help other families understand how to support traumatized children." Margaret considered the request carefully. They had shared their story locally, had participated in community education efforts about child protection, but this would reach a national audience. The decision wouldn't be hers alone. Samuel would need to be comfortable with the idea. "I'll need to discuss this with Samuel and his grandfather," Margaret said. "This would be Samuel's story to tell as much as mine. Of course, we would never proceed without the child's full consent and comfort level. If you decide to participate, Samuel would have complete control over what parts of his experience he chooses to share." After hanging up, Margaret returned to the kitchen where Samuel was adding the finishing touches to their gingerbread house. He looked up at her with the perceptive awareness that had developed during his healing process. "Important phone call?" he asked. Margaret sat beside him and explained Maria Santos' request in terms she thought he could understand. Samuel listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about who would see the interviews and how they would be used. "Would it help other kids like me?" he asked finally. "That's the idea." The people who work with foster children think our story might help other families understand how to help children who have been through scary experiences. Samuel considered this while carefully adjusting a candy cane fence post on their gingerbread house. Can I think about it? Of course. There's no hurry, and if you decide you don't want to do it, that's perfectly okay too. Ray arrived for lunch as planned, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the cheerful energy that had become such an important part of their daily rhythm. When Margaret told him about the phone call, his reaction was immediately supportive. Samuel's recovery has been remarkable, Ray said, settling into his usual chair while Samuel showed off their architectural achievement. If sharing our experience could help other families navigate similar challenges, I think it's worth considering. During lunch, Samuel surprised them by bringing up the interview request himself. Grandpa Ray, if we did the interview thing, would you tell them about how you knew I was safe with Grandma Maggie right away? What do you mean, buddy? That first day, when you came to the house, you could have taken me back to the police station or put me in a different foster home. But you could tell that Grandma Maggie and I belonged together, even though we'd just met. Ray's expression grew thoughtful. You're right, there was something about how you two interacted that told me you'd found where you needed to be. Your grandmother had this natural way of making you feel secure. And Grandma Maggie, Samuel continued, you could tell them about how you didn't try to fix everything right away, you just let me be scared and sad sometimes, but you stayed with me anyway. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at Samuel's insight into his own healing process. Is that what made you feel safe? That, and how you never lied to me about anything, even when the truth was hard. And how you made space for Daddy, in our family, even though you never met him. Over the following weeks, Samuel thought seriously about the interview request. He asked Dr. Howell about it during one of his sessions, and she helped him understand what participation might involve and how to set appropriate boundaries. Finally, on a quiet evening in January, Samuel made his decision. I want to do the interviews, he announced during dinner, but I want to make sure they understand that not every kid's story will be exactly like mine. Some kids might need different kinds of help. Margaret marveled at his wisdom. Even at 9, Samuel understood that his successful recovery was the result of multiple factors coming together: the right placement, the right support system, the right timing, and perhaps most importantly, the right chemistry between a lonely woman and a traumatized child who had needed each other in ways neither could have predicted. We'll do it together, Margaret assured him. And we'll make sure they understand that families can be built in many different ways, but they all require the same basic ingredients: love, patience, and the commitment to stick together through the difficult times. Samuel nodded seriously, then returned to his homework with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had become his trademark. For him, sharing their story wasn't about being special or heroic. It was simply about helping other people understand that healing was possible, that families could be formed through choice and commitment, and that love really could find a way to repair what seemed irretrievably broken. The filming took place in Margaret's living room on a crisp February morning, with Samuel sitting comfortably beside her on the sofa that had witnessed so many of their important conversations. The camera crew from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had arrived early to set up their equipment, but they worked quietly and efficiently, understanding the sensitivity of what they were documenting. Maria Santos conducted the interview with the gentle professionalism of someone who had spent years working with trauma survivors. She began with Margaret, asking her to describe that November evening when she first found Samuel on Maple Street. I was returning from the grocery store, Margaret began, her voice steady and clear. It was cold, darker than usual, and there was this small figure walking alone on the sidewalk. At first I thought perhaps a neighbor's child had been outside playing, but as I got closer I could see he was frightened and lost. Samuel listened intently as Margaret recounted those first hours, bringing him home, feeding him soup, waiting patiently through his silence. When Maria turned the questions to him, Samuel answered with the thoughtful consideration that had impressed everyone who worked with him. I was scared of almost everyone then, Samuel explained, but Grandma Maggie was different. She didn't ask me a lot of questions right away. She just made sure I was warm and fed and safe. She let me decide when I was ready to talk. What made you feel safest in those early days? Maria asked. Samuel considered the question carefully. She didn't try to pretend everything was going to be okay right away. She told me the truth about things, even when it was hard to hear. And she never got frustrated when I couldn't remember things or when I had bad dreams. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride as she listened to Samuel articulate his own healing process. Hollow had been right, children often understood their recovery better than adults realized. Samuel, Maria continued, your case led to solving a 25-year-old mystery and brought justice to many families. How does that make you feel? It makes me feel like the scary things that happened to me and to my daddy actually helped stop other scary things from happening. Samuel replied, like maybe there was a reason I ended up with Grandma Maggie, because she was smart enough to figure out what the clues meant. When Ray joined them for the second part of the interview, the conversation shifted to the investigative aspects of the case and the importance of community vigilance. But it was Samuel who provided the most powerful moment of the entire session. The thing people need to know, Samuel said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence that had gradually replaced his earlier fearfulness, is that kids who have been hurt can get better. But they need grown-ups who won't give up on them, even when they're scared or angry or can't remember things right. Maria leaned forward slightly. What would you want to tell other children who are going through experiences like yours? Samuel thought for a long moment, his young face serious with the weight of what he wanted to convey. I would tell them that it's not their fault and that there are safe people in the world who will help them. And I would tell them that feeling scared or sad is okay, but those feelings don't last forever if you have people who love you. After the crew finished filming, Margaret served coffee and cookies while Samuel showed Maria and the camera operator around their home. He pointed out the guest room where he'd first slept, now redecorated as his permanent bedroom. He showed them his father's memory box, explaining how he'd added his own treasures to David's collection over the years. This is where I do my homework, Samuel said, leading them to the kitchen table where Margaret helped him with his studies each afternoon. And this is where Grandma Maggie taught me to cook pancakes. She says cooking together is how families take care of each other. As the visitors prepared to leave, Maria pulled Margaret aside. I've been doing this work for 15 years, she said quietly, and I've rarely seen such a complete transformation. Samuel's resilience is extraordinary, but it's clear that your approach to his healing made all the difference. We helped each other heal, Margaret replied. I needed him as much as he needed me. Sometimes I think we were both lost, until we found each other. That evening, after Ray had gone home and Samuel was working on a puzzle at the coffee table, Margaret reflected on the day's experience. Sharing their story publicly had felt like closing one chapter and opening another, moving from private healing to public witness, from receiving help to offering it to others. Grandma Maggie, Samuel said, looking up from his puzzle, do you think the interview will really help other kids? I think it will help the grown-ups who work with other kids understand what children need, Margaret replied, and sometimes that's the most important help of all. Samuel nodded and returned to his puzzle, satisfied with her answer. Watching him work with his characteristic patience and focus, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from strangers meeting on a dark street, to a family strong enough to share their story with the world, hoping it might light the way for others walking similar paths. 2 years later, on a warm May evening that carried the promise of summer, Margaret stood in her backyard watching Samuel demonstrate his pitching technique to a group of younger children from the neighborhood. At 11 now, he had grown tall and lanky, with a kind of easy confidence that came from knowing he was loved and secure. The backyard had been transformed over the years into something Robert would have marveled at, a combination playground and garden where children gathered regularly for impromptu games and Eleanor's legendary lemonade. What had once been Margaret's quiet refuge had become the unofficial community center for Maple Street's families. Mrs. Whitmore, called Jenny Martinez, whose 6-year-old daughter was among Samuel's eager students, thank you again for hosting the block party planning meeting. Samuel's idea for a community safety workshop is brilliant. Margaret smiled as she watched Samuel patiently adjust little Sophia's grip on the baseball. The community safety workshop had been his suggestion after their interview with the National Center had aired and generated interest from other neighborhoods. Samuel had proposed teaching children about safety while also educating adults about recognizing signs of trauma and distress. Ray appeared at the garden gate, carrying a box of equipment for the impromptu baseball clinic. At 68, he had fully embraced his role as neighborhood grandfather, showing up wherever children needed patient instruction or gentle guidance. How's our coaching staff doing? Ray asked, surveying the scene of organized chaos in Margaret's backyard. Samuel's got them organized better than most professional teams, Margaret replied, watching her son demonstrate proper batting stance to a mixed-age group of enthusiastic students. The transformation in their community extended far beyond Margaret's backyard. The Thornfield case had prompted Cedar Falls to implement comprehensive child protection protocols, regular training for school staff and community volunteers, and a network of support that ensured no child's distress went unnoticed. Samuel had become something of a local celebrity, not for his trauma but for his leadership in making their town safer for all children. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a tray of sandwiches, moving more slowly now at 81 but still determined to feed anyone who gathered in Margaret's space. She had officially appointed herself Samuel's honorary grandmother, a role she took as seriously as any professional responsibility she'd ever held. "Samuel," Eleanor called, "bring your students in for snacks. Growing baseball players need proper nutrition." As the children trooped toward the house, chattering excitedly about their lesson, Margaret found herself thinking about the phone call she'd received that morning. Patricia Howell had called to share news that the child trauma recovery program they'd helped develop was being implemented in 12 states, with Margaret and Samuel's story serving as a cornerstone of the training materials. "Mom," Samuel said, using the term that still made Margaret's heart skip with joy, "Emma's family wants to know if we can do the safety workshop at their church next month. Her pastor thinks it would be good for their community too." Margaret nodded, noting how naturally Samuel had assumed the role of coordinator for their outreach efforts. At 11, he understood that his recovery gave him a unique platform to help other children, and he embraced that responsibility with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything important. "What do you think, sweetheart? Are you ready to present to another new group?" "I think so," Samuel replied. "Emma and I have been practicing our presentation, and Grandpa Ray said he'd help with the demonstration about how to talk to scared kids." As evening approached and the neighborhood children reluctantly headed to their own homes for dinner, Margaret found herself alone with Samuel in the kitchen they'd shared for over 3 years. He was working on his homework, while she prepared their evening meal, their comfortable routine as natural now as breathing. "Mom," Samuel said, looking up from his math problems, "do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't found me that night?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as she always did when Samuel asked about their journey together. "I think about it sometimes. I think I would still be living alone in a quiet house, probably feeling sorry for myself without realizing it. And I think I would have been lost for a lot longer," Samuel finished. "Maybe forever. But that's not what happened," Margaret said, reaching over to smooth his hair in the gesture that had become their private language of affection. "What happened is that we found each other exactly when we both needed family most." Samuel nodded and returned to his homework, but Margaret could see the smile playing at the corners of his mouth. As she watched him work, she thought about the letter she'd received last week from a foster mother in Ohio, who had watched their interview and successfully helped a traumatized child settle into her home using techniques Margaret had described. The ripple effects of their story continued to spread, touching families they would never meet, helping children they would never know. But here in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their daily life together, Samuel's artwork on the refrigerator, Ray's reading glasses forgotten on the counter, Eleanor's latest casserole dish waiting to be returned, Margaret understood that the most important success wasn't measured in public recognition or professional program. The most important success was measured in the sound of Samuel's laughter, echoing through rooms that had been silent too long, in the security that allowed him to focus on math homework instead of Survivor, and in the simple miracle of a family created not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice to love and protect each other. Outside, the maple tree that had witnessed their first meeting spread its branches over Maple Street, sheltering a community that had learned the power of paying attention, of acting with kindness, and of believing that every child deserved to be safe, loved, and home.